Hello, hello. This is Derek from One River Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. In this episode, what I want to talk about is the history of white tea in particular. Last episode, if you checked it out, it's all about the history of tea in general, from the very, very earliest traces of Shen Nong in prehistory, supposedly discovering it by it falling into his kettle as he's boiling water, all the way into the Tang Dynasty. You get the Buddhists that are drinking it in their monasteries and bringing it all throughout China. You get Lu Yu, who's raving about it and drinking it as this powder. And this powder persists, this powdered tea persists in the Tong and the Song. And I bring this last episode, all the way up to the Ming Dynasty when they finally start de-enzymating their tea and selling loose-leaf tea. And this is when the great emperor Taizu creates that proclamation that all tea, all tribute tea to the court should be loose-leaf. And after this happens, the game changes. And that proclamation by Emperor Taizu, by Zhu Yuanzhang, happens right around the end of the 1300s. And what really happens here is that loose-leaf tea gets green-lighted and takes off like we've never seen before. So loose-leaf tea, all the places that were previously making these powdered tea cakes suddenly are making de-enzymated tea, and they're finding out different ways to do it. And so we get all these different methods. Some people are steaming it still, some people are pan frying it, some people are wok roasting it. And one of the earliest places that really creates a lot of this loose leaf tea is the Wuyi Mountains. So this is northwestern Fujian. And also on the other side of that, what we'll get into later in this episode, is northeastern Fujian. And this is Fuding, the white tea origins. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself. This is essentially pre-modern / modern tea, what I'm talking about right now, the loose leaf, the de-enzymated stuff. What I want to do in this episode, same as I did with the last episode, is get back as far as I can into ancient history and talk about what white tea could have been, the mentions of it we see, the potential hints that we get throughout history that white tea could have existed here, white tea could have existed here. And spoiler alert, a lot of my sources are telling me that white tea really didn't get created until about 200 years ago. This is 1800s. This is right in the middle of the Qing Dynasty, which all checks out with what I'm working toward in that preamble here. But let's make the case for white tea. What if white tea did exist in ancient history? What if this is the tea that Shen Nong drank, that Shen Nong discovered? Maybe this is the tea that they're drinking as medicine back in the Xia Dynasty and the Shang Dynasty and the Zhou Dynasties, which are all prehistory in China. Maybe, since white tea is just the most natural, sun-dried form of tea, this is what it was. So let's get as far back as we can into the ancient history of China and see if there is a place for white tea to be born. Now, going back as far as we can in Chinese history, we get to the beginning of the Chinese civilization. And this is the time of the 3 sage kings and 5 mythic emperors. The 3 sage kings were Sui Ren, who lived about 18,000 years ago and taught humans how to make fire. And there was Fu Xi, who taught humans how to domesticate animals, and my favorite part, devised the 8 trigrams of the I Ching. These are the yin and yang, broken and unbroken lines, and this was a proto-written language of the time, and also used for a lot of divination in the future, and still used today. We also have Shen Nong. Shen Nong was one of these sage kings, which I mentioned in the first episode. He taught humans how to farm. He also invented barter and trade, so curse him. And finally, after Shen Nong come the 5 emperors: Huang Di, who discovered medicine; Zhuan Shu, who invented law; Dai Ku, who invented government bodies that serve the people, departments of agriculture, departments of forestry, whatnot. There was Yao, who devised the agricultural calendar further than Shen Nong did. And there was Shun, who divided the country into the 12 different states, each with their own administrator. After Shun comes Yu. Yu founded the Xia dynasty, which is supposedly 2070 BCE to 1600 BCE. Now, the reason I went so deep into those 3 sage kings and 5 mythic emperors is because it brings us all the way from ancient prehistory, the discovery of fire, all the way into the first mythic dynasty, the Xia dynasty. And this is essentially where time, measurable time, begins, and it connects us from the present all the way back into the past. And so where does the birthplace of white tea fit in? It fits in right with one of these 5 mythic emperors under the Emperor Yao. So the story goes like this. During the reign of the Emperor Yao in prehistory, there was this old matriarch who was living at the base of Sai Mountain. Sai Mountain is in modern-day Fuding. This is actually modern-day Taimushan, and we'll see why it's named Taimushan in a second. So she was living at the base of Sai Mountain. Her name's not recorded. It's just the old granny who lived at the base of the mountain as far as the myth goes. And what happened, there was an outbreak of measles. A lot of afflicted children were dying, and she was growing tea and found out that she could cure the children by feeding them tea. And so by cultivating tea, using it as medicine, she began to heal people at the base of Sai Mountain. And a lot of people from the region were bringing the sick people there, and she was curing them. And she started teaching the people how to use tea as medicine. And this is really interesting because this is before the Han Dynasty, which we mentioned, the Bensaojing, the Materia Medica kind of came around at that time. And so this could be one of the original places where tea was viewed as medicine and put into the annals of collective understanding. Now, what happened is after she died, people had so much respect for her that they renamed Sai Mountain Taimu Mountain. And Taimu, it means grandmother in Chinese. And so here we get a wonderful myth that burns right through history and connects the present with the eternal past, where here is a mountain that has its roots in healing, has its roots in tea, and the name of the mountain comes from this ancient matriarch who lived thousands and thousands of years ago. And although the tea that she was making, that she was growing, that she was cultivating is still a far stretch from modern white tea, well, we can take the seed of this story. We know that there was tea probably in the Taimushan region in ancient prehistory. And so we can kind of glean that no matter what. However, the tea that was likely made there was very basic, probably naturally dried, probably sun-dried. And so a lot of people say, hey, that's the first white tea. That's the origin of white tea. The origin of all tea is white tea because it's the most natural, it's the most sun-dried. However, I do not believe that sun-dried tea, natural sun-dried tea, is the same as modern-day white tea because I've seen a lot of modern white tea production and I've seen natural sun-dried tea. On that note, I have a really great story for you about finding some of the most ideal, pristine, beautiful, naturally made, sun-dried white tea I've ever come across in my life. I was actually visiting a tea friend in Menghai in Sichuanbana. You probably know him. His name is He has this amazing artistic pu'er tea company called White, and he makes his own pressings. He goes to all of the different mountains. He finds the right tea. He mixes them himself. He makes small batches of productions and makes incredible artwork for all of his labels. But I was hanging out with him in Menghai. I think this is 2017. And he took me to a tea mountain, a gushu tea garden, which was just, a treat. We were going to go up into the mountains and walk in the gushu fields. The gushu fields. It sounds like Elysium or something like that. Walk in this mountain. He had a wonderful farmer that was the Dai minority, and she was going to take us into the mountains. So from Menghai, we drive, an hour and a half into the mountains, up these switchback roads or whatever. And we get into the area where they're living, and then we have to walk another hour or two into the mountains itself. And doing that, this is one of my favorite parts about going to the tea mountains, is the local woman who lives on the mountains and, is the daughter of the tea farmers. She's going through and telling you all of the edible plants in the area. She's like, oh, you can eat that. You can eat this one. This plant is spicy. You can eat the roots of that. And as she's doing it, she's collecting them. And she's going to put them into the dinner that we're going to make when we get back to the house. And she's also giving me some plants. She's like, oh, you can take this back to Jiangsu and plant it and grow it. I'm like, fantastic. And so I actually left with a bunch of plants from that mountain. Anyways, we're walking and we start seeing all of these old trees kind of interspersed in the garden. Beautiful, thick trunks, taller than I am, taller than my buddy is. And we come across one beautifully large gushu tea tree with moss on its trunk, but a seriously broken branch. And at first, I'm brokenhearted about it. I'm like, wow, what a loss. But my buddy is like, yo, he notices a bunch of dried leaves on it. He says, man, we can take this and we can make it tea. This is natural white tea. I know you've heard of gushu tea. I know you've heard of danju tea, but have you ever heard of danke tea? And so the joke here is like, oh, it's not only gushu, it's not only single tree, it's single freaking branch, which how exclusive can you get? Like, this is the most outrageously rare and naturally produced tea you could possibly find on the mountain. And so we excitedly pick all these dried leaves off and put them in with all of the other herbs we're taking home. And so we get back to the village at the top of the mountain, and we get the gaiwan out, we heat up the water, and we brew the tea. We're really excited for it. It smells pretty nice. And we drink it, and it doesn't taste like anything. It's so unremarkable that, like, the best part about this tea was the mountain spring water that we used to brew it with. There was zero flavor to it. And I thought it was going to be like the most mind-blowing experience of my life because it was so exclusive, so natural, so perfect, and everything checked its boxes. But this is just sun-dried tea without any type of parameters set to it. And so that's what I've discovered from this story, is that to make white tea, to make enjoyable white tea, you have to be very aware of the amount of sunlight, of the amount of how quickly it loses its moisture, how quickly it dries, when to take it out of the sun, when to put it back in the sun. And so, yes, while technically within modern parameters, sun-drying tea makes it white tea, and that's the difference between white tea and all the other types of tea. But if you just take tea, fresh tea, and put it in the sun, you're not going to get anything close to the white tea that you can get from Fuding today. And so these two are essentially not even comparable, in my opinion. What you need to do to make modern day white tea is approach it with a scientific mind. Approach it with the idea that we need to get it from 100% moisture content to 20 or 30% moisture content in a period of 48 hours without raising the internal temperature too much, and making sure that the water can get out of there very quickly. So there's so much going on when you're actually making white tea that to equate any form of sun-dried tea to modern-day white tea is just inaccurate. So now that we've essentially established that modern-day white tea is unequivocally different from any natural sun-dried tea of antiquity, we can get past these legends and get into our first mentions of what could possibly be white tea, mainly because the location is accurate. So totally dispensing with myths and legends about tea means that we're going to have to wait until the Tang Dynasty, because that's when we first started getting primary source materials. And the first and the brightest star comes from Lu Yu and his Tea Classic, which he wrote right in the middle of the Tang Dynasty. I believe it's 760 AD. And Lu Yu writes that there is tea production in the mountains 300 miles east of Yongjia. And this is that tiny, tiny grain of sand that a lot of white tea scholars have latched onto, because Yongjia is current-day Wenzhou in Zhejiang. Wenzhou is right on the coast, and so 300 miles east of Wenzhou is literally dead in the ocean. Like not a sighting of land for 298 miles. And so what a lot of white tea scholars have thought of is maybe there was a mistranslation and a miscopying, because a lot of times at the ancient times, what would happen is scholars would rewrite these, and they would rewrite them reading the ancient texts, and they would copy them by hand, and there's a lot of chances for a single character to be miswritten. And sometimes this is intentional, sometimes this is unintentional. We see this a lot with the Tao Te Ching, the Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, the classic of Taoism, where sometimes elements of the philosophy that came to light later on, like maybe weren't present with the initial book, but were present 1,000 years later, like the idea of Wu Wei, the idea of not trying and non-action. This is something that's barely mentioned in the original Tao Te Ching, but then has become a tenet of Taoism. And so a lot of times the scholars will start reading into that too much, and as they're rewriting these texts, they'll kind of tweak this, tweak that, and be like, oh, maybe this is what it was actually meaning. And so we see this in other books. And so the idea that there's this really big mistake here, where it's 300 miles east of Wenzhou is the ocean, and maybe somebody meant to write south, and it was just copied as east or something like that. And so if you go 300 miles south of Wenzhou, you get Taimushan. And so the belief here is that this is an actual one of the earliest mentions of white tea being produced in Taimushan by Lu Yu in the Tea Classic. Now, the second earliest primary source material we get is by Emperor Huizhou in the Song Dynasty. And this is a red herring because he praises white tea that comes from the Ningbo region. Again, Ningbo is also very close to modern-day Fuding. However, he talks about how this tea is difficult to make because it's so hard and it doesn't steam well, it doesn't bake well when they're processing it. And so this is the red flag here, where if it is truly white tea as we know it today, it's not being steamed, it's not being baked, it's being sun-dried. Now, this also brings up something very interesting about tea naming culture from the Song Dynasty, where we're getting these famous teas that are faked and reproduced and stolen and everything, even like we're getting the brands on the tea cakes and stuff like that. And everyone's creating a really nice name for their teas. And so essentially pre-Qing Dynasty, like Qing Dynasty, as I mentioned earlier, is when we see that clear delineation between the styles and that organized structure of naming, where this is white tea because it's unoxidized, this is black tea because it's fully oxidized. Before the Qing Dynasty, anytime you see something that's called a black tea, something that's called a red tea, a yellow tea, a white tea, these are just essentially brand names for the tea. And one clear example of this is the Anji Bai Cha. So, Anji Bai Cha, I believe it's a mutation in the leaf that creates a very, very white leaf. And so what they do is they make it no different from how they make green tea, but it turns white in the processing, or it's much more lighter in the cup and stuff. When it brews, when it steeps out, it doesn't quite look like green tea, and so they call it Anji Bai Cha, but it's not Bai Cha. It's the oxidization phase is killed in the kill green. It is a green tea. So when Emperor Huizhou talks about white tea, even though it is produced in the right region, even though it is called white tea, there's still a different processing method. So the tea in the Song Dynasty, again, as I mentioned in the last episode, is still not this de-enzymated tea that we're looking at in modern times. So backing off the history real quick, I've used this term de-enzymated a whole lot in this episode and last episode, and I want to give a real quick working definition for how I'm using it, because I'm no student of biology and I would love to learn more about the biology and the chemical processes that are happening in the plant, and that could be a great episode in the future, perhaps an interview with somebody who really knows their stuff. But the way I'm using it is the enzyme that's responsible for oxidizing is being denatured and rendered inert through this heating process called kill green in Chinese tea. And so if you really don't know anything about oxidization, this is what turns the banana peel from yellow into brown. When you open an apple and leave it out to air, this is what browns the apple. It's this process that is being killed in the processing of tea. And by doing this, they can fix the tea at a certain level of oxidization, maintaining chlorophyll levels and this nice green, fresh taste. And so this is the technology that doesn't come around until the Ming Dynasty. So let's get into white tea in the Ming. Now, our most modern and reliable mention of what is likely the grandfather of modern-day white tea comes in the Ming Dynasty. And again, this is when everyone's drinking tea. Everyone's drinking loose-leaf tea. Tea is elevated to an art. You see all strata of society enjoying the beverage. And a lot of laymen are talking about it. They're drinking it. They're writing treatises on it. And we see a lot of first-hand scholarship about it. And so there's this Ming Dynasty scholar named Tuan Yi Hengtian. And he says that tea makers can be broken into two groups. One group of tea makers use fire, and the other group uses the sun. And this is amazing because it's the very, very first clear early delineation between what is white tea and what is all the other types of tea, essentially. White tea lovers can also take this a little further because he also follows that up to mention that the latter is superior here. Using the sun is the most natural, the most clean, the best way to make the highest quality tea possible. And so he kind of looks at the people that are using fire as like primitive people that are just using old technologies and stuff. And so it's really cool to see this change and this development of technology. So, to mention the Taimushan mountain in particular in the Ming Dynasty, it is home of one of the 50 famous Ming teas. This is the Lu Shui Ya, the green snow bud. And this is, if you want to think of it, an ancestor of the silver needle. Now, mention of the Lu Shui Ya comes in records of the 28th year of the Wanli era of the Ming Dynasty, about 1600. I mentioned all these weird dating conventions last episode, and so it's funny to see them when I'm doing this research. So it's essentially right before the beginning of the Qing Dynasty, this green snow bud, the Lu Shui Ya, really becomes famous. Now, I actually want to share with you this story that is actually kind of blew my mind as I was doing this research, is because something that happened to me a long time ago suddenly makes a lot more sense. And so this is back when I was sourcing tea in Taimushan. I was in the mountains. I had already found some really wonderful tea in Panxi, and then I was traveling to the Taimushan mountain just for fun. This is back in 2019. Taimushan is a beautiful mountain. I've been there 3 times, and it's really marvelous because what you get is these really smooth boulder type mountains that just rise in just like staggering pillars covered in green trees and stuff like that. They're not massive mountains, and they have this really cozy feel, and there's just really, really soft, smooth edges everywhere, and it just juts up from the earth like a bunch of finger bones. And so what's really cool about this mountain is it has this feeling of, it's almost surprising to see these kind of rock structures, and it's very, very iconic and noticeable in the surrounding. And so I was there one day in April. I think this was late April 20th or something like that. So they'd already finished with a lot of their harvests. This is the late Mudan harvest. And when I get up onto the mountain, I hike the mountain one day, take all the photos. It feels like Rivendell, where there are like these like really beautiful like iron rod walkways on the side of the mountains that are overlooking the valleys and stuff. It's absolutely beautiful. And so I sleep on the mountain. It's this crazy huge hotel, and I'm literally the only guest there. I have no idea what's going on. It really kind of freaks me out because it's got some serious spooky vibes because it's all old wood. In the middle of the second floor, there's this massive, I would say multiple tons of this like hand-carved piece of just this giant peacock emerging from the trunk of a tree, but it's just covered in dust. And like I said, I'm literally the only one there. It looked abandoned. I went into the hotel. I asked them, I was like, do you guys still open for business? And so yeah, they were. And so I stayed there, and then I woke up in the morning, and just to add to the eeriness of it, I wake up and I look out the window and I can't see a single thing. There is fog so thick I can't even see the trees outside of the window. And so I go down to the front desk, I ask them about it, and they're like, yeah, it probably won't clear until this afternoon. And so I'm like, you know what, I'm not going to hike the mountain today. And I was going to try and figure out if I could find some tea. And so I go to the convenience store, and I was talking to the guy who I was talking to last night. He's super friendly. And actually, I'll get back into this in another episode too, because he's the second one who tells me about some of the new government legislations in Fuding from 2018 that they're banning summer harvests, that they're totally outlawing pesticides, that now gongmei can no longer be made and sold as Fuding baicha. And he was kind of excited about it. He was just gossiping about it. And I asked him, I was like, oh, you seem like you know tea. Like, do you know anyone who makes tea? And he's like, oh, I used to make tea. And I'm like, used to? Like, what are you talking about? He's an older guy. And he's like, oh yeah, my village sold all of our land, or at least all of our land, to the Lu Shui Ya Collective. And I'm like, okay, I've never heard of that. And he's like, you've never heard of this? This is the Lu Shuiya. This is like the biggest organic tea company in China. And I'm like, I still haven't heard of it. And he makes a lot of work because he's, bless him, he's speaking like Mandarin, but with a heavy, heavy Fujianese dialect. And if you've ever heard the Fujianese dialect, it's almost unintelligible. It's the dialect that just blew the imperial court's minds when they were like connecting China and pulling through everything. They're like, okay, like we understand these people. It's very close to Mandarin. And then you get to Fujian, and they're speaking this Minnanhua, which is the native language of Taiwan as well, or similar to it. And they just can't understand a single thing. And so this guy, he's speaking okay, well enough, and he's telling me all about the Lu Shuiya cooperative. Or I don't believe it's a cooperative. I think it's just a company. But they lease the village's land, and he was super excited about it. He was like, yeah, now they give me a couple won every year. And won is like 10,000 renminbi. And so he's getting like 30,000 renminbi. Like, how much is that? But he's getting $4,000 or $5,000 from this company every year just to let them use his land to grow tea. And he doesn't have to do anything. And so he's sitting high on his castle right now. And I'm just kind of brokenhearted because I was like, this could have been it. This is like my guy who lives on Taimushan, who has like, you know, the old village and stuff. And I kind of express it to him. I was like, man, I was really hoping I could find somebody who's making tea on the mountain. He goes, oh, I know a guy who hasn't sold his land yet. And so he calls the guy up, and the guy comes to pick me up. And we're going to go out to his land, which is right behind the Lu Shuiya protection zone, organic zone. And so, again, like this is my first time hearing about Lu Shuiya, so I have no idea what he's talking about. But apparently this Lu Shuiya is the home of the original type of white tea that was grown in the Ming Dynasty in Taimushan. Because literally we're up on the slopes of Taimushan. And here's another thing about mountains in China, especially. Taimushan is not a single mountain. It's a mountain range. Huangshan, not a mountain range. And so when you talk about Huangshan Maofang, there are many, many mountains that you could be talking about. When you talk about Taimushan tea, there are also many mountains in that range, like the Wuyi Mountains, right? Anyways, and so we're going up on the slopes, and what's cool is the fog starts clearing, and he's pointing out Taimushan in the distance, and he says, you can always see Taimushan from this area. And it's pretty cool because, again, the Taimushan, the particular mountain, the tourist mountain where they don't grow tea, you can see has like these 4 fingers that jut up and is very noticeable. But again, we're all still within the Taimushan range. And so he is taking me to his land, and we actually have to drive through this organic tea zone, this Lu Shuiya collective. And he stops at the gate and he points it out. And again, he's making a huge deal about it. And I'm like, I have no idea why everyone keeps talking about this so much. And it's only now that I'm realizing that it does have, it's essentially, and you'll see this a lot in the Chinese tea culture, the modern Chinese tea culture. And we saw this with Lu Yu in the last episode, who's trying to sanctify tea with Shenong. You see this with the Buddhas trying to sanctify tea with Bodhidharma. And you see that with modern Taimushan tea farmers trying to sanctify their tea with Ming Dynasty tea. And so this desperate connection to make what is currently produced synonymous with something that was produced in ancient history. And so we drive through this incredible, huge organic tea farm. I think it's like thousands of acres, or probably 1,000 acres. It's several thousand mu, and a mu is like 1.166 acres, so maybe under 1,000 acres. Anyways, we drive through it. It's beautiful. It's well maintained. It's all organic. It looks great. We get to his village, and he's kind of like the head of the village, and he's trying to create this kind of community living style. His projects are fantastic. I really can't wait to get back out there. I haven't been able to get out there because of COVID restrictions. But we get there, and they're uprooting, they're burning a bunch of tea bushes. And at first I'm like, hold up. What's going on here? Why are you burning these tea bushes? And he says they're useless now. I'm like, oh, did they not produce? He's like, no, they're all the local heirloom. They're all Saicha. They're all gongmei. And because of that government regulation, we can't use this to make silver needle. We can't use this to make baimudan. We can't use this to make shomei. And he says they're just tearing them all out and they're planting the Da Bai Hao varietal. And so I was like, that's curious, because I first heard about the legislations from my tea producer. Then I heard from the convenience store guy. And then I see this new producer who's actually burning his bushes because of this legislation. I'll get in a little more into all of these specific legislations that are going on in Fuding in another episode. But it's really interesting. The point I want to get here is what I discovered about him in this land. This land apparently is right behind that Lu Shuiya collective, Lu Shuiya company. I have to do research into it, but it's a little aqueous as far as if it's a company, government sanctioned, if it's a collective, because China's very weird about allowing people to take land because you can't buy and sell land, especially in Fuding. And so there's this idea of leasing land, but you can't quite lease it for this. And so in order for them to gain access to the villagers' land, it has to be semi-collectivized, I believe. And so it gets a little aqueous in the terminology. Anyways, the point I really want to make here is that I'm talking to this guy, learning about this guy. His name is Zhu, and he's where I got this incredibly beautiful, wild harvested, charcoal roasted silver needle, which is way too expensive. I put it on the site a little bit, but it was just way too expensive. I think I sold maybe 200 grams of it, and I kept the rest, the other kilo of it, for aging purposes, right? But I'm talking to him, trying to figure out his history, how long he's been making tea. And he says, oh, my grandfather started planting all these and making these teas about 80 years ago. And I was like, oh, cool. So your bushes are 80 years old. And he says, no, we had to tear all those bushes up too because he was making red tea, hong cha, black tea. And I was like, wait, you guys were making black tea here? And he's like, yeah, that's all Fuding used to make. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And so I'll get into this a little later. Like, what happens is because of export, because of trade and everything, the popularity of white tea just totally dies in like the Qing dynasty, and it doesn't come around until about 2000. And so taking a couple steps back now, let's talk about white tea production in the Qing dynasty, and then we'll follow its ups and downs all the way to the modern era. Now, as I mentioned earlier, modern white tea's origin can be traced back about 200 years ago, and this is in the Qing dynasty. This is about 1820s. This is right before the Opium Wars. And so what we're seeing here is that Fuding is finally creating cultivars, and there's a big difference here between varietals of tea and cultivars of tea, especially how I'm going to be using them going forward, these terms. For me, varietals are the naturally occurring tea in a different region, based on the climate, based on the soil and everything, that it just naturally came to be on this mountain in this region. Cultivars have a level of human interaction involved with them. And so for me, the difference between a varietal versus a cultivar, varietals are natural selection, where cultivars are artificial selection. And artificial selection, to use these Darwinian terms, is when humans interfere with it, versus natural selection is when it's just left to nature. And so what you get in all these different regions are different styles of tea, different varietals of tea. And then humans start drinking those teas and then start changing them for their own benefits. And so that becomes the cultivar, and that's the artificial selection for it. Now, the first mention we get of a varietal of white tea that we know of today is about 1796 in Fuding. There's the early Qing. This is an author, Jia Qing, and he mentions that Fuding created a silver needle out of the xiaobai. And the xiaobai is, as we know, this is the sai cha. This is the gongmei varietal that my friend was tearing out of his fields because it's no longer any good to a lot of farmers. And so it wasn't until 1850s, like right in the midst of the Opium Wars, that we start getting this new varietals of tea, this Hua Cha number 1 and Hua Cha number 2. Hua Cha number 1 is the Dabai. Hua Cha number 2 is the Bai Hao. And these two cultivars, are blended together usually. I went to a field in Taimushan, and he's growing. He knows this plot is Dabai, this plot is Bai Hao, and he just blends them together. And so that's how we get the cultivar Da Bai Hao. So the Da Bai Hao is actually the Dabai and the Bai Hao mixed together. And so they're actually two cultivars that are very similar. I think it's the Bai Hao is a little fatter. the dabai is a little thinner. I'll get into a full episode on the different types of cultivars of white teas later. But what's cool about this is we get the invention of silver needle in about 1885 is when we see the first white silver needle made out of the dabai varietal. Before that, we were dabai cultivar. Before that, we were getting the saicha varietal made as silver needles. And eventually it gets rebranded as earth needle just because it's so totally different, because they eventually, after creating the dabai hao varietal, they start making silver needle with it, and the silver needle is thick and fat and hairy and just looks so good. Eventually the stuff they're making here with the dabai hao varietal sells for 10 times more than what they're making with the Saicha varietal. And so the Saicha silver needle gets rebranded as earth needle just because it's so different, and it's just like to their opinion, it's really not worth its time and effort. And again, this is all in the Qing dynasty in the mid 1800s in China. Now, one of the fascinating points here that we can touch on in the next episode, when I really get into the different areas that are producing the white tea in Fujian and Fuding, is the unique geographical location of Fuding with regards to international export. And so during this time, this is right around the First and the Second Opium Wars, and so China, as a result of foreign influence, had shut down a lot of trade, a lot of maritime trade. There were a lot of bans and embargoes and stuff going on, and Fujian, especially northern Fujian and Fuding, you get a lot of secret coves, a lot of secret harbors and secret ports and stuff like that. I think there were over 100 smuggling ports all through northern Fuding and Fujian. And the biggest one, second only by Xiamen, then known as Amoy, was a harbor in Fuding called Sacheng. And the Sacheng harbor, I looked on it in a map. If you follow its inlet up the river, you hit Diantou. And Diantou is known as like one of the best places for white tea, one of the earliest places where they were producing white tea, and like the hub of like cultural, like historical white tea. And it turns out it was just a smuggling port. It was where they were making white tea for smugglers to be shipped abroad, to be sold under the curtain for European silver. And so it's really interesting. I'm going to touch on it in the next episode and stuff like that, but it's just really, really wonderful because, again, what's happening is there's this revitalization of Diantou in the modern tea world, where it's the cultural hub for Chinese white tea. It has its history. This is where the white tea markets always happen, but really its birth was a smuggling town, a smuggling operation. And so it's pretty fascinating to see. Anyways, we get a few more statistics going forward. From 1912 to 1916, Fuding and Zhenghe produced 50 tons of white tea per year, each worth about 1.26 tons of silver per ton of tea. And so this is where it's essentially worth its weight in silver, the tea that was being made at this time. And so in the early 1900s, things look pretty good for the white tea farmers, but lo and behold, 20th century history comes, and we find ourselves facing, World War I. And so suddenly, all of this exported tea that's happening in the 1912s, 1916s, from 1917 to 1921, World War I is just destroying sales because the Europeans are no longer spending thousands of tons of silver to buy tea. They're, worried about something else, I guess. Whatever. Anyways, it really doesn't recover. The white tea market doesn't recover until they start making black tea. And so they start making black tea and selling it to their Soviet friends up north. And that is a really good business up until the 50s. And in the 50s and the 60s, when the Soviet power begins to dissimulate, that's when that kind of situation deteriorates, and then black tea suddenly isn't selling so well. And this is essentially where my friend's grandfather was when he was making a lot of black tea in Taimushan for export. And what happens is we're rescued by the miracle of human ingenuity under the catalyst of economic struggle and difficulties, because some tea factory in the 1960s discovers how to replicate sun-dried white tea by using hot air. And all of the sudden, now what used to take a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money can be made for a fraction of the cost. And so now we're starting to see the production and export of of shomei, of baimudan, of white peony, in addition to the silver needle. And one of the biggest international buyers are people in Hong Kong tea houses, Guangzhou, Guangdong tea houses. And so what's really cool is we're seeing this advent of kind of white tea come around back in the 1960s. In the 1970s, it's, really going into Hong Kong and Macau, but really it doesn't come back to China. It doesn't catch on in modern domestic China until the 2000s. And it was 2007. That is the specific date. And I'll get into this in another episode, when white tea became a really, really big name domestically in China because of a really, really intelligent mayor of Fuding that launched this hugely popular marketing slogan, 1 year tea, 3 years medicine, 7 years treasure. And from this, he started pushing that Fujianese white tea is good for the health, it's good for storage, it's as good as gold if you're buying it and investing in it. And everyone just loved it, caught onto it, and then they also improved their place in the market by putting in a lot of these legislations, which I'll talk about later, which will also go forward and preserve the integrity of the product. And so one of my tea farmers talks about how he loves the new legislation because it's inflation prevention. They're discouraging the creation of bad products. They're discouraging summer harvests. They're not letting the market being flooded by an inferior product, and so it keeps the cost of Fuding white tea high. And as a temporary result, what we see is a lot of people moving to other regions like Zhenghe and Yunnan and Sichuan to make their white teas. And again, I'll get into this later in other episodes, but right now that kind of brings us right to where I want to get to. In 2007, we see the advent of white tea in China. And what does this mean? This means that aged white tea in China, if it's before 2007, it's probably fake. And I'm just going to go right on the line and say it. It's probably fake. I've seen it a few times, but always in very rare instances. And it's cost me $300, $400, maybe $500 for the gin if it was over 2007. And so I see people selling 30-year, 40-year, 50-year Fuding white tea, and I'm just like, obviously there's no way. And so for me, really, like, I don't even go over 2010 very much, because that's, if you think about it, if you think white tea begins to catch on domestically in 2007 with the idea of aging, how are you going to get a tea? How are you going to get a lot of tea from that era? Very, very few teas come from that era. It's not until 2012, 2014 that people are like, okay, this is actually catching on. This is building traction. I'm going to buy a bunch of teas and I'm going to store them and save them and release them later. Until then, before that, it's not really in the collective consciousness. And so I'll get into this again with aged tea in another episode, because we're about at 40 minutes here. And I could talk a lot about this, and I will talk a lot about this. But again, what I wanted to do is just bring revision a history of white tea and really put it into the modern perspective, because what we learned here is that sure, sun-dried white tea existed in the Fujian region for a long time, but sun-dried white tea without any kind of parameters doesn't make good white tea. Actual modern-day white tea with the Cai Cha varietal or the Da Bai Hao varietal was only around for about 200 years. And a big part of its production history happens around the Opium Wars, when they're illegally growing it and smuggling it out of China for sales. And then this gets crushed in World War I, and only comes back with the invention of new technologies that make it easier to make white tea in a less desirable way. And this is another thing I'll talk about, the methods of production, where anytime we make it with hot air, it's of an inferior grade than if you make it with pure sunlight. But anyways, so we get this huge bump of white tea in the late 1960s, and then we see it exported in the 1990s, and we see it come back to China finally 2000s, 2007. And so that's where I'm going to end the episode. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the extra stories, some of my tangents, and catch me next time. Well, I'm going to keep this white tea conversation going and talk about the different regions within Fuding, and maybe touch on the different varietals and cultivars as well. And so again, this is Derek from One Over Tea. Thanks for catching this episode of Tea Soup. And until next time, brew happy.